Hello, and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Mariel Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. Hi, listeners. After receiving great feedback from folks all over the world who are finding the podcast helpful, we've decided to start answering listener questions. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast, head over to the podcast page on our website, bayareadbtcc.com. There you'll find the link to submit your own question. That's bayareadbtcc.com. We can't guarantee that we'll get to every question, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. And if you're finding this podcast helpful, please rate and review us in iTunes. Today's episode is going to focus on getting through the holidays. So the holidays are upon us if you're listening to this as this episode is being released. And we know that this time of year can bring up a lot for people. So we wanted to talk about some of the challenges that can come up during the holidays and some skills that might help you get through it.
I think that in the United States, there's a lot of societal pressure. The holiday song that comes to mind is like the most wonderful time of the year. So there's just like a lot of pressure that this is the happiest time of the year and everybody's getting together with their families and loved ones, and it's so wonderful. And that can often be quite challenging.
Yes, and I'm glad you said in the US because we know we have listeners from all over. But so we have Thanksgiving. This episode will probably be airing around the time of Thanksgiving. And then, of course, Christmas.
And New Year's. Yeah.
Oh, I forgot about New Year's. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, it just keeps going.
Yeah. And so maybe we should begin by talking about some of the hard situations that we hear folks talking about.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that people are common themes about struggles with the holidays.
There's a lot of emphasis on families during the holiday season. And for many folks that we work with and, people in DBT, family can be really tricky, or a family of origin. So the family that we grew up in, and maybe even our present day family structure. And so as you were saying, Ed, with that, the most wonderful time of the year, I hadn't thought of that song in a long time. And wow, what pressure. But there's such an emphasis on family togetherness and this kind of mythical family gathering where everyone's around a fireplace and a big kind of feast and maybe a tree, and everyone's happy and jolly or merry. And that is so often not the case. So just even that pressure, I think, can create the sense in so many people that something is lacking, because how many people actually have that experience or have those kind of family dynamics?
Yeah, I think that sometimes people's experience during holiday events is, it's fun, it's nice, it's good to be together, because there is this added pressure of this is supposed to be this momentous moment of being together. Even in families that tend to be pretty comfortable with each other, it can be hard. And there isn't actually a lot of room for people to be able to say, I'm actually not doing so great this year or at this time of year or today because it's a holiday. We're supposed to be happy. And so I think that people tend to go into family gatherings with a sense of internal pressure. I think that especially if there's unresolved stuff in families, there's a sense of a little bit of apprehension about what might come up, what might people be saying or doing or thinking, and all of that can increase anxiety.
And if we take that example that you had of like the more functional family, I don't know how else to describe it, but maybe a family where there's not a lot of trauma or really hard stuff in its history. Even in those families, you're right that there can be a lot of pressure to appear a certain way. So you might not be able to be honest about how you're doing. And even in those families where it's more functional, there's more like overt love and caring, there's not a lot of trauma history with the family. Oftentimes we're spending more time with the family than we usually do. We might be traveling, which can add its own sort of pressure and stress and can make us not our best selves. So there's more concentrated time together, even in the best of families, which I think is hard.
Right. Again, like so often people are traveling to be with whoever they're spending the holiday with, whether it's family or friends or whoever. And a lot of people are traveling. So travel tends to be pretty hectic and stressful, whether it's airports or bus stations, train stations, traffic, all of that kind of stuff adds to the stress. And then being around oftentimes people that we don't see for a lot of other times in the year. So being around family members that we don't see on a regular basis, we don't necessarily have a lot of contact with, that can add to the pressure and the stress. Another dynamic that I have experienced and hear a lot is the sense of, like, for instance, going to visit parents and feeling like being with family members as an adult, feeling all these feelings that we had when we were like teenagers. And I actually
Hmm.
just had this conversation with my own mom yesterday about the holidays and how it's like, even when people are really, really secure in their identity, being around like a family dynamic at a holiday, there can just be this, like deep memory of being young that comes forward. And all of a sudden I feel like a teenager and I want to bicker with my mom. Um,
Hmm.
and so, like, I think that's an added dynamic that can often come up.
Yes, absolutely. I remember when I was in therapy school, a teacher talking about, and he, had white hair. He was older. He's saying, I have been a therapist for 30 plus years and I go home to see my parents and it's like I'm 10 again.
Right.
Like even with all the work he had done. So those, right, those old dynamics, even in, more functional or happy families can come up, certainly. And let's talk a little bit about the families that are not so happy or functional, because that's
Hmm.
where I think folks will really need to pull out more skills and need to do some more intentional preparation or coping ahead, which is one of the skills we'll talk about to help you deal with those families. And so this might be a family where maybe there's been some, as I said, some traumatic history. You might be going back to a family where you were chronically invalidated, and that's going to happen again. You might be around people who have substance abuse or mental health issues, or, I mean, we're probably not going to cover all of them, but the whole host of things that are painful
Right.
and more or less dysfunctional you might be confronting.
Right. And again, I think one of the things that people struggle with is that we might be confronted. So going to visit family and having a lot of incessant questions about what are you doing and why are you doing that, and a sense of, like you said, being invalidated, having our experiences just overridden by other people's expectations or impressions of us. In DBT language, their judgments of us. And when we know that a family dynamic is going to be tough, there's going to be tension. Maybe we have to face somebody who we've had extreme conflict with, someone who was really abusive to us. There's just, a lot of anxiety can come up around facing that.
Hmm. And so there's a several different skills I think that could be helpful. And of course, if you're a regular listener to this podcast or have done DBT therapy yourself, you can, flip through your notes and your books and find other skills that maybe we won't touch on today. But one of the first ones I think of is cope ahead, because that's what we're
Right.
talking about in this whole
Yes.
episode is how can we cope ahead with difficult situations. And this is something that, it's a involved skill that we talk about in depth in a different episode, but let's maybe do like a quick run through to remind folks how you actually do it. So the first thing with the cope ahead skill is to describe the situation that is going to likely prompt some kind of problem response in you. So you're thinking ahead, okay, I'm going to see Uncle Joe. He's going to ask me for like the upteenth time why I'm not married or whatever it might
Right.
be. And I know whenever this happens, I tend to snap. And then I say something and then I feel bad about it afterwards because I've come off, angry, whatever the situation might be. So this requires you to kind of think ahead of time, like, what are the problem situations and what do I think is the behavior I'm going to do that is going to maybe create additional problems. And sometimes it's not an overt behavior, like I'm going to snap or I'm going to reach for a substance when I'm really making an effort not to do that. It might be something more internal. So the skill, the way it's structured, asks you to think about what kind of problem behavior might you do in response to a difficult situation. But I think when we're thinking about the holidays, we might also want to add in what might be an internal kind of problem or painful emotion that might get evoked. So my uncle is going to ask me again, how come I'm not married? And maybe I won't do anything in response, but inside I'm going to feel really ashamed. It's going to
Right.
be like he, scratched a wound that was just healing. I'm going to feel all terrible about myself. And how come I'm not with someone? And I'm so unlovable, and whatever might happen. So you can think ahead of time, like who's going to say what to whom and who's going to do what and how am I likely going to feel and act.
And I think with this part of coping ahead, of just naming and describing what we need to cope with, I think an important aspect is also to check the facts and try to be non-judgmental, and just like, what are the facts of the situation? So Uncle Joe often asks why I'm not married. I often feel shame in response. I find a strong urge to reach for substances, as opposed to Uncle Joe always is so insensitive and he is the worst. And then I responded and then I act like an idiot. Like, that's actually not going to be helpful, probably,
Mm-hmm.
to have all of that judgment. So being able to like note what's happening and what we need to prepare for, and try to really check the facts and be non-judgmental about it.
And sometimes even doing that, like taking the time to think about, okay, what actually happens and what's said and what does that evoke in me can be really helpful, even if you don't go further.
And so then, if once we know what it is that we need to cope with, we want to decide what to do. What coping or problem solving skills do we need to bring to that situation, and to really actually be specific? So I'm going to need to think about, my emotional response is probably not going to cut it, but saying like, I will likely notice shame, and so I want to try to be mindful of my emotion. I want to validate myself. I'm maybe going to remind myself before and after and during the event of things that I am proud of in myself to counteract that shame. I'm going to write down for myself some things that other people have told me they appreciate about me to counteract the shame. Like, be specific about what will help to deal with the reaction that we are concerned about.
So the next step is to imagine the situation in your mind as vividly as possible. So imagining it as if it's actually happening, seeing yourself there. So it's a mental rehearsing.
And again, the point of that is that if we really think about, okay, when I see Uncle Joe, let me imagine what that conversation is going to look like and how I'm going to cope and what I'm going to do, and really imagine doing it. And the benefit of that is that it helps us practice ahead. And as we've talked before with the cope ahead skill, just imagining doing what we want to do is as valuable as doing it in terms of our sense of preparedness and practice.
Yeah. So you're rehearsing in your mind what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, what you're actually going to do. And this is so valuable in preparing yourself for when it actually happens. And then if you're going through these steps on your own, remember to practice relaxing in any way that is helpful for you. Maybe it's taking a walk around the block or taking some deep breaths or listening to some soothing music, because it can be stressful to sort of go through the whole cope ahead skill. So remember to practice relaxing after you rehearse in your mind.
So to kind of summarize what we can do in order to cope ahead for these challenging situations: number one, describe the situation that we're going to be encountering, checking the facts, being non-judgmental. Number two, decide what we're going to do to cope. What will we need to do? And then number three, imagine what the situation will be. And number four, rehearse how we're going to implement our coping strategy. And then number five, give ourselves a break and relax afterwards.
Yes. And I want to add just some other skills that can be useful to think about if you're going into a challenging family situation. And one of the ones that comes to mind most frequently for me is radical acceptance, that your family is who your family is. You probably can do very little to change it. And so radically accepting both your family as it is and yourself and your family, and whatever the consequences or outcome has been of you being raised in the family that you were raised in. And this can bring up a lot of emotion. It can bring up grief. It can bring up anger. I think those are the two most common ones. But if you allow yourself to feel those emotions, at the end, or usually the eventual outcome is feeling like a sense of peace. And again, when we're talking about radical acceptance, and we did a whole previous episode on that, which you can go back and listen to, acceptance does not equal approval. So we're not saying it's okay that whatever bad things happened in your family, we're not saying that that's okay and people get a carte blanche, but we are saying like it did happen and we can't do anything to change the past.
And the point, the value in radical acceptance is accepting reality as it is rather than spending energy fighting reality. And so often our distress comes from that fight rather than what actually is, or more so than what actually is. So just noticing, what are the family dynamics that I'm dealing with? What is it about myself that I struggle with during this time of year and during these gatherings? And just accepting this is what it is rather than trying to fight it. It should be different. I should be different. Just this is what it is. And that again can help us be prepared to cope effectively in the situations rather than going in with a sense of like, I should be different, or they should be different, or this should be different, because we don't have the power to make things different. We can only kind of do what we can do within ourselves. Acceptance is a better starting point for that.
Yeah. And I think about stories I hear of how that creates so many problems when adult children go back to their family of origin and think they're going to change their parents and siblings and aunts and uncles and cousins and whoever else is there, and how that never really happens.
The idea that radical acceptance is not approval. Oftentimes, we are confronted during holiday times with family dynamics that are harmful and painful and difficult. And I don't think we need to have a stance of, okay, it is what it is. This isn't going to change. There may be aspects of the family dynamic or our engagement with the family dynamic that we would like to change. Holidays are often not the time to do that, because as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, there's so much pressure on everyone. And so holidays are not necessarily a time for a lot of change. And going in with radical acceptance can help us strategize about what we do want to change. Sometimes, when people go to family events, they have a sense of like, I tend to not say what's on my mind. I fall into the dynamic of, just letting other people say whatever they want and I don't speak up. We might cope ahead with, how could I say something a little bit without the pressure of, because I'm going to change the family dynamic, but more, I'm just going to say what's on my mind and then cope with whatever the reaction is. Accepting that I probably won't change these dynamics in one Thanksgiving dinner.
Yes. And I like the focus of what on the individual, what we can change ourselves as opposed to changing other people's behavior. Like, I'm going to get my mom to be a different person. That's not going to happen.
Right.
But how can I respond to her differently that might feel better? And who knows, might change the interaction between us. But what can I do? Not how can I change other people?
And one of the dynamics that can often come up during holiday season that we haven't talked about yet is kind of the other end of the spectrum of people. Some people are really struggling with being around family in a difficult way. And for other people, there's more of a struggle of being on their own during the holidays. Not necessarily being with family or friends, and sometimes feeling a sense of isolation or feeling a sense of like I'm out of sync with everybody else because I'm more on my own. For whatever reasons, and radical acceptance of like, this is where I am right now, followed by coping ahead of like, okay, if I'm going to be on my own, what do I need to make this a helpful time for me as opposed to something that's really painful? So for instance, I have a friend who has a lot of difficulty with family and has created a tradition of like really thoroughly enjoying time on her own on both Thanksgiving and Christmas, and has created traditions for herself of reveling in that time to herself and time to do exactly what she wants to do rather than going and being around family members that are going to be so painful. And so part of her coping ahead was to create a new tradition for herself. And all of that comes from a starting point of acceptance. This is what is. It's not healthy for me to be with my family, or I just don't have the family relationships that I'm able to be with family at holidays. So I'm going to create my own traditions.
And that's one of the beautiful silver linings, I think, for people who their struggle during the holidays is not that they're going home to a challenging family situation, is that maybe they don't have family or they don't have the relationships that they want in their life. The silver lining is you get to create your own rituals. So, what worked for me about what we did during the holidays and what didn't? And what would I like to bring in? What's going to be a way to take care of myself during this time? And experimenting. I love how your friend is using the holidays, because usually, people are off work. There's some more free time as a time and place for her to be more quiet and take care of herself. So figuring out what might work for you in creating your own traditions and rituals.
And touching on another DBT skill, that is a form of building mastery, which also increases our emotional resilience. Of like, I have the capacity to create what I need in my life, and whether it's around being on my own or whether it's around being with family, I'm building mastery and creating what I need in my life.
And another challenge that can come up during the holiday, which we were just touching on, but we didn't quite name, is I think just the whole theme of loss during the holidays.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone you loved has died, oftentimes during the holidays, that memories of them can come up more starkly. And there can be more grieving because it is a time where there's such an emphasis on family togetherness. So that's actual loss of someone you love has died, but it's also loss perhaps of a relationship that ended. So breakups or divorce or ending of important friendships. And another way I think about loss during the holidays is, as you touched on a moment ago, Ed, is maybe just not having the kind of relationships you want in your life, at least presently. So feeling like, oh, I don't have like the kind of friend group I might want, or I don't have a relationship, I'm on my own. So or my family is just too hard for me to be around. So there's a loss there. And that's something that is so often not talked about when we talk about the holidays.
Right. And I think that even people being with family, there can also be a sense of loss of being around family members that are challenging to be with, and that sense of like, yeah, this is really hard, and the sense of loss of carefree family time or something like that. So that's where I really feel frustration with our societal pressure around all of November and December into the beginning of January, of like, yes, so a great time to be connected and happy. And it's usually mixed, so that there can be plenty of moments of connection and moments of real contentment. And there also can be moments of loss or grief or frustration or struggle.
Yes. And for the loss and grief, some distress tolerance skills might be helpful. I think particularly under Wise Mind Accepts, which is one of our distracting skills, there's a distress tolerance skill around contributing, which might be particularly helpful during the holidays. And that's helping other folks in need, maybe people who need a hot meal or are homeless or someone who's ill. That can be a way to shift the focus away from your own suffering and feel useful. Another distracting skill that comes to mind falls under the acronym IMPROVE, for Improve the Moment. I mean, any of those, there's imagery, meaning, prayer, relaxing, doing one thing in the moment, taking a brief vacation, encouragement, and rethinking the situation. That's a quick rundown of improve, but any of those can be helpful. I think particularly maybe meaning making can be useful during the holidays, trying to find meaning in your challenging situation. And also, and you've already alluded to this, Ed, kind of encouragement and rethinking the situation. You can do this while you're coping ahead. That's sort of thinking about your self-talk. Like, okay, you're doing a good job. You're going to get through this, whatever you might need to encourage yourself to get through some of the more stressful times.
And I think another one of those improve options is doing one thing in the moment, which gets to the kind of one mindfulness or using mindfulness skills. So finding things that you do enjoy, and another distress tolerance category of skills is self-soothing. So finding things that are really soothing, especially if you experience the holiday seasons to be stressful, finding things that are soothing and comforting and mindfully engaging those, letting that sink in of like doing those things that you appreciate. There can be a lot of pressure during holiday seasons to do what other people want to do what's expected, to go to a lot of like work parties and family parties and that kind of stuff. And finding those moments where you're doing what you want to do, you're soothing yourself and doing it mindfully.
Yes. And on that note, I'm so glad you brought up work parties, because parties and social gathering are often a big part of what happens during the holiday season, which makes me think of the please skills,
Hmm.
which I don't believe we've talked about on the podcast, but the please skill falls under emotion regulation. So this is a skill about taking care of your body and your mind so you will reduce your susceptibility to being in strong emotion mind. And so the please skills, the P and the L stands for treating physical illness. The E is for balanced eating, which I think is an important one during the holiday because there's a lot of festive foods that maybe you're not usually around. The A is for avoiding mood altering substances, also a really important one during the holiday season because there's often lots of alcohol flowing. S is for sleep, another important one during the holidays, because if
Hmm.
you're partying more or busy, getting presents or doing holiday cooking or whatever you might do, your sleep might be off. And the last one, the E in the please skill, is for getting exercise, which also can be challenging during the holidays if you're busier.
So the please skills are like really such a helpful foundation for our emotional resilience and stability in general all year long, and as a coping ahead strategy, focusing on our eating and making sure that we're keeping a balance, or focusing on exercise or sleep. Oftentimes, people that I'm meeting with will talk about how helpful it is to be like, I am really prioritizing these physical health things that keep me resilient. Because, for instance, people know if I don't get enough sleep, I'm going to have very little patience for other people. Or if I drink too much, I'm going to really struggle to maintain what I want in my conversations with people. And so, attending to all of those things can be a helpful focus to keep us on track for our own personal goals during the season.
Before we end, let's talk a little bit because we've talked about, challenging family situations and going home to see family or traveling, the forced togetherness. We also talked about if people are alone and feeling lonely or experiencing a lot of grief due to losses during the holidays. So these different scenarios. Let's also just talk a little bit about some of the upside or the positive
Hmm.
in terms of being able to experience moments of joy and connection and some of the things that might get in the way of that.
And I think another skill that I think about is the skill of mindfulness of others, which is under the interpersonal effectiveness skills of like when we are in social gatherings with other people, rather than being really self conscious, being focused on enjoying what other people have to say, listening, really genuinely listening, and being involved with other people. And so I think one of the benefits and a way to focus during the holiday seasons when there is a lot of social interaction is to take the opportunity to really listen to others, to enjoy getting to know people, to connect, and find ways to mindfully do that.
Yes. And I think mindfulness in general can be helpful in any of these kind of social situations. So letting go of self consciousness and also trying to let go of worry, which can make what might be a pleasurable situation not so pleasurable. So trying to let go of what you have to do tomorrow, what you didn't do today. And if you're having a nice moment with a coworker at a holiday party or with a friend you haven't seen for a while at a different holiday gathering, just trying to see if you can allow yourself to be in that moment.
In terms of the more benefits of the holiday season, I do think that people tend to a lot of times have associations and memories of past holiday experiences and spending some time remembering those things in a way that is positive and feels nourishing. To think about positive memories you've had during holiday experiences and give yourself some time to have some nostalgia in a way that's helpful. If nostalgia is stressful, then maybe not as much, but I think that can be a benefit.
The last thing I want us to talk about is some unique challenges that we didn't address. I want to talk for a moment just about race, ethnicity, and religious differences that can come up more starkly during the holidays. And so here in the US, we celebrate Thanksgiving, which actually has a really hard and troubled history with the Native Americans of this country. And so that for Native Americans can really be thought of as a day of genocide for their people. And I know I've heard from some of my Native American friends that there's a real push and encouragement to not feast on that day. So I just want to note that can be a particular challenge, especially if you are of Native American heritage and you know sort of the history of this holiday. So not to kind of gloss over that particular challenge. And also, we were talking about Thanksgiving and Christmas because those are the biggest holidays that we face in the US, that not everyone celebrates Christmas.
Right.
And so that can have its own challenges when everyone is making such a big deal on this day and everything is shut down and you don't celebrate Christmas.
Right. And again, there's also other holidays that don't get as much attention because not as many people are observing, like Hanukkah or Kwanzaa. And so, like being able to be mindful of your own experience. So if you celebrate a holiday that isn't on the major list for that time of year or any time of year, to really mindfully enjoy what your own holiday celebrations, whatever they might be. And if you do celebrate the major holidays, to be conscientious of friends and family who maybe don't, or even conscientious that other people may be having a harder time with the holiday than even you are.
Yes. And for different reasons.
Right. So this is a summary of lots of different things to be conscientious about as we approach these end of the year holidays. And we obviously have not covered everything. And so I think our biggest encouragement is to really do what will be helpful to you in whatever way. And our hope that this end of the year holiday time can be a time where you find those moments of contentment and even joy.
Thank you. If you're listening to episodes as they get released, we'll be taking a break for the holiday season and we'll return with new episodes in 2020. Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at bayarea.dbtcc.com. That's bayarea.dbtcc.com.